They don't have a coin?
I do. Bitcoin.
Okay. Okay. Oh, there. Thanks.
Judge, could you announce the resolution of the three? Sure. Just read it.
Just
All
read
three resolution.
Okay, so scenario choice number 1 is Gov is the Lincoln administration led by President Abraham Lincoln, newly elected in 1861. The Confederacy has seceded from the Union. Resolved, let the South go. Do not fire on Fort Sumter. Scenario number 2, Gov is the Polk administration led by President James K. Polk in the fall of 1847. General Winfield Scott has just captured Mexico City. Resolved, annex Mexico. And scenario choice number 3 is Gov is the newly elected administration in 2016, taking over from Obama-Biden. Congress is advancing a bill to terminate the domestic electronic surveillance program. The administration has classified intelligence of terrorist operations forwarded by the program, which have saved lives of American citizens. However, revealing the information would not only compromise methods and sources, but the exposure would threaten and potentially cost the lives of informers. So resolved, declassify and publicize the intelligence in order to inform the public and save the surveillance program.
Never gotten a 3-act resolution before.
Sorry, since I...
Which team is the government taking account?
All right, we'll remove choice 1.
Okay. We will remove scenario 3.
Okay. So that time is done. All right.
Starting.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, I'm Jacob Shao. I'll be the Prime Minister. Thank you very much for judging. The Prime Minister, Jacob Shao.
Matthew Lutz, leader, member of government. Thank you for judging. Matthew Lutz, member of government. Thank you for judging.
Jonathan Lyle, leader of the opposition. Thank you very much. Jonathan Lyle, leader of the opposition. Thank you.
Jack Anderson, member of opposition. Pleasure. Jack Anderson, member of opposition. Matthew Lutz, member of government. Thank you for judging.
I'm Jacob Shao. Thank you for judging.
Jonathan Lyle, leader of opposition. Thank you very much.
Jack Anderson, member of opposition. Pleasure.
So for all right. Excellent. The 1800s were a great time for America because America was in the process of expanding and ordering new frontiers. However, America failed to commit one action that would have benefited the United States greatly. Now, this one action was annexing Mexico. This is why my partner Matthew and I firmly believe in the resolution to annex Mexico. Now, before getting into the issues, I'd first like to offer up some resolutional analysis to clarify the resolution exactly. Now this you can write down as should, not could. Now this resolution specifically implies that we're talking about what should have happened, not what could have happened. So anything that has to do, any argument that has to do with whether or not it could have happened is irrelevant, as in this round we're talking about what should have happened in the past. This leads us to a background point, which can be written down as 1847 Mexico. 1847 Mexico. Now, there was a very particular situation, which is the reason for this resolution. The situation is that the United States and Mexico were just riding the heels of the American-Mexican War, with America winning. Now, at that point, the United States was annexing large portions of Mexico, which are now known to us as Texas and as Nevada and California, as several states in those areas. In fact, much of the West and part of the Midwest used to be Mexico. However, the United States didn't go through and annex the rest of Mexico, which is what we today know as Mexico. So with that, from here on out, I'm going to be talking in the present tense, as that's what the resolution implies, so get ready for that. Let's start off with the first mandate of Annex Mexico. Annex Mexico specifically as a state, meaning that Mexico will be absorbed into the United States with senators and congressmen and everything that other United States currently have. So Mexico will retain all of the benefits of a United States state. So with that, let's get into some contentions to show exactly why this is a profitable venture, starting off with the first contention of slavery abolished. Now, recently, of course, we annexed large parts of Mexico, now known as California and Texas and many other states. Now, the reason that that action was opposed largely from members of the United States was because of the South. Now, those areas are in the South and bordering on the South. And as you know, the South is filled with mostly people who are pro-slavery. Now, the reason that they were threatened by the United States actions is for a couple reasons. First, they would have been surrounded by free states, or they will be surrounded by free states, and now partly are. When they're surrounded by free states, it's much harder to keep up slavery as an institution. However, the second and more specific example is because of politicians. Now, the more politicians there are in the United States for a specific cause, the easier it is for that cause to get passed. Now, many of the, in fact, the large majority of people in the New Mexican states are actually anti-slavery, which means that if we absorb the rest of Mexico, we also get those politicians as anti-slavery legislators. Now, the reason that right now slavery is not that threatened by the states that we've already absorbed is because we haven't yet absorbed enough to really offset the balance of the pro-slavery politicians. However, going through and annexing the rest of Mexico would mean that we have more anti-slavery senators and more anti-slavery congressmen, effectively tipping the balance in the Senate and in the rest of Congress and the House of Representatives. Yes?
Quick question. Was Texas a slave state?
Well, parts of Texas were.
Okay.
Effectively, we would be abolishing slavery by threatening it fundamentally as an institution by tipping the political balance in favor of pro-slavery legislators. So with that, let's move into the second contention, which can be written down as national security. Absorbing Mexico as a state into the United States, into America, would mean better national security. Now, one reason for this can be written down as buffer state. Now, we would effectively be having an entire buffer state on one side of the United States, which means in the case of a war or an invasion, they have to tread through that much more ground to really get into the heart of our current United States. However, the second and more important reason is because of effective borders. Now, currently, the United States is stopped after where Texas and New Mexico and California end, which means that our Mexico-United States border is over 2,000 miles long. However, the border between Mexico and the countries under it is only 500 miles. Mexico is essentially a triangle, which means that if people are trying to attack from the pointed end of the triangle, they have to get through a very small space to get to the flat end of the triangle. This means that we get to stand our large ground while forcing opponents to come through a very small point. This means effective border control, effectively protecting our national security measures. Another way this would improve our national security is because of immigration. It's much more easy to control immigration when we make the people immigrating come through such a small spot. We can particularly let in those who we do or don't want in the United States, whatever those decisions may be. So really, we're improving national security all around by creating this triangular buffer state on the bottom of the United States. Let's move on to a third contention, which can be written down as economic gain. One of the most important reasons to annex a country or a state is because of the economic gain that would follow. Now, Mexico has a lot of different economic resources, as evidenced by the newly annexed California and parts of Texas and Nevada and New Mexico. So far, we've gotten a lot of agricultural resources from them. There are several trade agreements that Mexico previously had with other states that we've now absorbed into the United States, which means rather than just taking parts of Mexico, we should go the full mile, rather absorb all of Mexico and get that many more benefits, that many more trade agreements, that much more agriculture. Any industry that were to erupt in Mexico, we would receive as a personal benefit for America as the United States. Now, this culminates in a fourth and final contention, which can be written down as avoid conflicts. Avoid conflicts. Now, one of the main reasons to absorb a state is because you ensure that any conflicts that could erupt between that state and yourself in the future would be avoided. This is particularly important because of Mexico's extremely large size, which means that if we absorb it, we don't have to worry about that country, that state, as a potential threat to America. If that ever may turn out in the form of immigration issues, in form of national security, in form of any sort of illegal trade going on, now the United States can effectively stop that. We can see that there are several advantages to annexing Mexico. We've already done it part way. We should go through with it all.
So is everyone ready? 407 years ago, oh wait, actually that's 14 years ahead of time. So let's first actually just start, we're just going to be going down the flow, responding to their argumentation as they brought it up. But before we get into their actual case, I'd like to respond to the resolutional analysis really quick. They didn't actually define it as either a policy, a fact, or anything. They just said we should be looking at should we do it, not could we do it. But I just like to respond to this. They need to take an action. And we believe they did take an action, but because they have taken an action, we need to be looking at basically the advantages versus the disadvantages, not just contentions here. I urge that you say that it can happen too. We need to look not just should it happen, but because this is an action, would it be effective? And that's critical, because if you look to the resolution, resolve, annex Mexico. That's an action. Why do you do something if it doesn't succeed? You don't. So we'll be addressing this as we go down, responding to their case, and then bringing up some solvency and then disadvantages. So first starting on contention 1. Now, under contention 1, they said slavery would be abolished. Now, my first response is no proof of slavery-free state. No proof of slavery-free state. They had really no reason why Mexico would be against slavery at this point. Actually, they have Texas that they say is partly slavery. So if anything, they're going to be conflicted. They're not going to be on one side or the other. They're going to be conflicted. Now, my second response is that of agriculture-based. Because they actually have a different type of agriculture there, we see that areas that slavery was most common, sadly it wasn't based on human rights. It was based off their economy and their agriculture, and Mexico was a location of agriculture. My third response is that of a term, resource drained. Because we would be attached to this new country, this huge, wide country that we're now annexing into a new state, we would be resource drained because we would have to rebuild after the war. Mexico is no longer rebuilding. The United States is rebuilding. Now we're going to be resource drained by the time of the Civil War. And the impact here is that the Confederates win the Civil War. Civil War. The potential here is really massive and ultimately would lead to the impacts they were saying is basically human rights abuse. So actually annexing Mexico would lead to more human rights abuses than it would to helping them. Yes?
So in 1847, what is this Civil War you speak of?
That's 14 years later. So just to be clear. All right, so now let's move down to contention 2, that of the national security buffer. Now under this, they said that it would create a national security buffer. Now I have a few responses. My first response is treating it as a lesser state. Treating it as a lesser state. The idea of states is not to have them as buffers. The idea of states is to be collected in a federation, and the impact here is actually a racism. We would ultimately see our country seeing them as a lesser state because there's some asset used to protect ourselves from invasion. This is absolutely not the correct method to collect a state. Now my second response here is what threat? I mean, if we look to the South American countries, they never threatened us in any way. Now, let's move down to now their contention 3. Now, under the contention 3, they said economic gain. First off, I'd like to turn saying limited resources. Let's specifically look to oil, where the United States, we restrict our resources extremely. If it weren't for Mexico's different policies, we would not have a major source of oil. If we looked at, because Mexico is a separate country and has different policies over their oil, we're able to import from Mexico. But because of the United States policies, we would ultimately see a lack of resources. Yes?
What is oil?
I'm hoping he's joking. I don't know. All right, moving down to contention 4, they said that we would avoid international conflicts. Now, this is absolutely not true. We may avoid international conflicts, but we do not avoid domestic conflicts. Now, let's look at history. When countries are taken over, what happens? Massive, or basically rioting. There's never a peaceful takeover of a country. Just think about that. It's a takeover of an entire country. We look at the example of India, where the Britain tried to take control of it, and ultimately it led to a revolution. So we really can't see this as avoiding international conflict when we have a country that doesn't want to be under our rule. That is a conflict right in our backyard. So now let's move, sorry, no more questions at this time. They're kind of getting redundant. Let's move down to the solvency point. Solvency point 1 is that a Supreme Court overturned. Supreme Court overturned. So let's first look at actually what the resolution says. The Gov is the Polk administration. What's important here is that the administration actually has no right to add states to the United States. What would this lead to is the Supreme Court would ultimately overturn the affirmative team's decision because they are the president. They have no right to add a state. Now let's move down to the second solvency point. Now the second second solvency point is that of civil war. Now because of the Civil War, we would be resource drained. Once again, we would lose Mexico as a state because this is already a forced annex. This is a forced annex, and Mexico did not ask us to come in and join in the United States. This is a forced annex, meaning that Mexico would likely just break away once again. Now that the United States is distracted, they would break away from the United States. Now let's move down to the disadvantages. The disadvantage is that of imperialism. We'll see at the A point is that Mexico did not want to join the United States. The B point is the government team takes it anyways. The C point, the internal links, is twofold. The first one is that they're destroying a nation. Now they're going to come up and say, well, we took Texas and California just fine. There's a difference between completely dissolving a nation and collecting territory. Collecting territory has been done for years, and it's considered, in general, it's considered more okay than taking an entire nation and destroying a national identity. Now the impact here is that of ultimately, it has the potential for cultural genocide. Actually, Mexico was split in their cultures, which has the potential for actually not only revolution, but cultural genocide, as we see this country split through war and forced annex. And that's what's critical here. It's not like states who wanted to join. Mexico did not want to join the United States, yet the government team is suggesting that we go in and sweep them up. I mean, that's great. Absolutely not. We create this mindset that we can go in and just destroy any country we want, just if we want territory. If you look at their contentions, what are their contentions? It would help the current United States, not that it would help Mexico. The purpose isn't even to help Mexico, it's to help the United States. It's a selfish type of imperialistic policy that ultimately leads to destruction and human rights abuses, and that's why I strongly urge an opposition ballot.
Okay. Now in the last speech, the congressman basically was talking about this issue of all these ideas like oil imports and this supposed civil war, but in reality, all of these arguments, we have no idea what they mean in 1847. So let's go back to the president of 1847 and discuss the issue of 1847 and what we should be doing from this standpoint and not from some supposed future or alternate reality that they're creating. So first of all, their first response was basically no reason to believe that it will be a free state. Now I have a couple of responses to this. My first response to this is Mexico mostly free. Now if we look at the way Mexico is formed, Mexico is mostly a free nation. So therefore we can assume that once Mexico is annexed to our nation as a state, it would be a free state and therefore turn the tide against slavery and help us break the institution of slavery down. They never refuted the basis of that, and they never refuted that Mexico as a nation is mostly free. Their only analysis under this point was that we should not annex them because Texas had some support for slavery. But if we look to other places that we annex, like California, they show that Mexico does have some freedom, has freedom for it, and actually wants to abolish slavery. So therefore, if we do annex Mexico, we have the chance, the only chance of these two sides, to actually be able to abolish slavery in the current present time of 1847. That's the only chance in this world, and then we should stick with this chance. My second response to this is most of territory. The most of the territory that we're already annexing is for freedom, so therefore there's no reason to go with their side. Now let's move on to his next response, basically if resources drained. My one response to this is quote-unquote civil war. We have no idea what the Civil War is, and we have no idea what these resources are that we're draining for, so therefore there's no reason to even talk about this. We just stay in the present and talk about whether we can abolish slavery by annexing Mexico and not some future reality. Now let's talk about the idea of a lesser state. He basically said that we should not annex Mexico because we're supposedly lessening them by promoting the United States national security. My response is national security is key. Now, if you look to the United States, just because we're annexing another nation, and one of the benefits for us is national security, that does not make Mexico any bit of a lesser of a state. It just means that we both have more national security. The reason why is because we have a buffer state now between anyone who wants to attack us from the south, whether it be from Europe and they want to try to attack us from South America, we have a buffer state in the south. Whereas if we did not annex Mexico, we'd have to protect a 2,000-mile border, whereas now we have to protect a 500-mile border. That's the whole point of national security. And by protecting ourselves, we're ultimately protecting Mexico, because now we are committing ourselves to the Mexican people and saying that we will protect you if anyone tries to attack you. So it's national security for both, and it doesn't make it a lesser state. My second response to this is any threat. Now, it doesn't matter, they say there's no threat in the current system, but the whole point of national security is to protect ourselves from the future, whether there be any threat. Yes?
Okay, did you not say in your Prime Minister's speech that Mexico would be a buffer state?
It would be a buffer state, and all states, in a sense, are buffer states. It's just a benefit of having more territory that doesn't make it a lesser state just because you call it a buffer state. Now let's move on to my third response of vital benefit. Now, one thing that I think that the other opposition team is completely ignoring is that it's mutually beneficial for both sides. It's a vital benefit for both Mexico and the United States, and they've never addressed the point of actual national security in and of itself. They never actually refuted that idea, so therefore national security still stands, and America becomes a stronger nation. So we need to look at that first and foremost. Now, under the economic gain, he basically talked about a lot about oil imports. Now, my one response to this is quote-unquote oil imports. We have no idea what oil imports are in 1847, so therefore this is not even an issue. My second response is economics for both. Now, if we look to the true economic issues of annexing Mexico to the United States, it's not only economically beneficial for the United States, but also for Mexico, because now the industries can work together, they can trade with each other, and the economic benefits can flow between all states, because there's now no border separating us at all. So therefore, both countries mutually benefit from the economics, and therefore there's no reason to go just because of this supposed oil idea. Now let's move on to the fourth contention. One response to this was basically Mexico does not want. My one response is mutually beneficial. Now, even though Mexico might not want it at the beginning, once we annex Mexico, Mexico will like being a part of the United States because we will protect them as their national security. We will protect their sovereignty as a state, and we will give them freedom, and they will become a part of the strongest nation in the world. So there's no reason why Mexico would be dissatisfied when they already gave us California and other states without any hesitations. There's no reason to actually believe this. My second response to this is steps already taken. Now, if we look to what we're doing as a government in the current system, we're already taking steps to annex parts of Mexico, but yet they're doing nothing. We have taken over Mexico essentially. We might as well annex them and bring about benefits for both nations. There's no reason, just because of this idea of Mexico doesn't want. They did not want to give us other states, but the idea is they will become mutually beneficial for both the nations. Now let's move on to the idea of their solvency points. His first solvency point was that of president. My one response to this is the administration. If you look to the scenario, it does not say that we have to act only as the president. It says we have to act as the administration in the United States government. So therefore, we are solvent. Yes.
Does it say administration or United States government?
It says the administration, which includes several parts of the government. Now let's move on to my second response. For their second solvency point, they talked about a potential civil war. Our response to this is already taking their states. Now, if we look at the idea of civil war, we've already started annexing, but yet they can't really do anything. So therefore, there would be essentially no civil war. Now let's move on to their disadvantage of basically imperialism. I have a couple responses to this. My first is that of a stronger nation. Again, when you become a stronger nation, this disadvantage of becoming a stronger nation is not really bad for the United States. My second response to this is a stronger America and stronger Mexico. Again, if you look to the idea of imperialism, in and of itself, it's not necessarily a disadvantage. We have to look at if it will actually be beneficial for the United States and in Mexico, and they've never really looked at the actual benefits. They've only given you ideas that actually do not exist in the present for reasons not to annex Mexico. But if we look to the present, it will be beneficial for both nations, so therefore there's no reason to vote against us just because of this idea of imperialism. Now let's move on to the next and final disadvantage they had, and that is a cultural genocide. My one response to this is individually and directly happier. Now, if you look to the idea of Mexico, there is no reason to believe that by us annexing Mexico, that there would somehow be a cultural genocide. Because when you annex Mexico, it becomes mutually beneficial, and they've provided no proof that the Americans would just go in and kill the Mexicans. That is purely a basis, and it's almost a form of racism in this argument, because they're basically saying that we're just going to create cultural genocide against them. Yes.
So has the United States in its history never committed cultural genocide?
In small instances, but they've never just gone into a nation and just said we're going to kill all these people. America is a good nation, and they respect the people that they actually do take care of, and that they annex the states. They've never taken a state and basically culturally genocide the people. And I'm going to protect the time, so no further questions. So when we look at the ideas of the actual results, actually the actual arguments of 1847, we can see that we need to annex Mexico because it will be mutually beneficial for the United States and for Mexico, and they never really actually address the present time issues. Thank you.
Are we all ready? All right, let's begin. Well, good evening. Today we're going to be taking a look at the opposition's or the government's case and really seeing why, in fact, it is seriously flawed. So first, let's take a look at the contention one. They were arguing that slavery is basically being abolished, and we would get rid of that. And they said, well, Mexico is mostly free, and they're mostly part of the territory. And I have a couple responses to this. My first response you can tag as spreads out our military. Once again, spreads out our military. Best case scenario, if in fact this is a free state, at the very least we have to defend them when this civil war does happen, which will happen in about 14 years. I can see the future. My second I can see storms on the horizon, all right? Okay, my second response you can tag as American influence. Once again, American influence. We would see American influence brought into Mexico. Right now, the southern states are in fact very slavery-oriented, that influence would be brought into Mexico, which right now does not have any slavery influence. So you can actually tag the impact is tainted. This is going to be a tainted Mexico. Now they're going to have a more slavery influence. And so that responds also to the most of the territory. Moving on down to the Civil War argument, they basically said, well, we can't be talking about the Civil War right now. I have a couple responses. My first response is we need to be planning for the future. Once again, planning for the future. It is very clear right now that there is, in fact, a gap between the two states. There's a reason why the Founding Fathers didn't put slavery in the Constitution. It's because they were afraid of that terrible, peculiar institution. My second response you can tag as a double standard. Once again, double standard. Now, they did bring up immigration reform, and I don't think we had any immigration issues back in today's steps. Whoa, man, this tense is getting me confused. My third response you can tag is destroys education. Once again, destroys education. This argument really does destroy education. We need to be looking at the big picture, and obviously, Civil War was in fact a risk. 14 years before the Civil War, we were definitely considering that as an issue back then. Moving on down to the contention number 2 of national security, we said we're treating it as a lesser state, and they said it's not a buffer, and that they're protecting it from the future. Now, I have a couple responses. First, on the protecting from the future, I'd like to point out once again that's a double standard. They don't believe in protecting us from the future. But my second response you can tag is a disadvantage, unrest in South America. Once again, a disadvantage, it's unrest in South America. Now, what we see here is the South American neighbors, say Colombia and Brazil, are going to see, hey, look, the United States just invaded Mexico, and they're getting closer to us. And so what we see here is that there would be unrest. There would actually be anti-American sentiments in South America. So we're actually creating an enemy by going into Mexico. Not only are we creating unrest in Mexico itself, but also in the rest of the continent. So we'd be creating enemies, not creating buffers. So my second response is the buffer is on the wrong end. Once again, the buffer is on the wrong end. Mexico is below the southern states. So when we see those southern attacks in the future that are coming, the buffer zone isn't going to do anything. Now, moving on down to the argument of turn, they said we're going to have, we said we're going to have limited resources, and they said oil imports. we'll actually agree, sure, we won't deal with oil imports, but you can tag my response as an agricultural burnout. Once again, an agricultural burnout. We're still dealing with agriculture in the status quo, and we were doing massive plantation farming that was actually bad for both the environment and the economy, as we saw, because it was heavily reliant on slavery. And that's exactly what will happen if you vote for the government team. So let's move on down to contention 4. They said we're avoiding, or sorry, they said we avoid conflicts. We basically said they don't. And they said, well, it's mutually beneficial because it's good for them to be part of us. Now, I have a couple responses. My first response you can tag is historically denied. You can't mix two nations together like that and just hope that everything works out great. A great example of that is India. When Great Britain moved into India, we basically created a revolution. The Indians and the British did not get along well. There was a revolution caused there. A great example of current day, jumping way into the future, is Ukraine. Right now, there's basically a big social unrest because you have a split between the Russians and the Ukrainians because there's unrest there. They don't like each other. Now, and my next response you can tag is going back to the current status. The U.S. is not the strongest nation yet. Once again, the U.S. is not the strongest nation yet. We do not see this. They're simply put, Great Britain is actually the great superpower in the War of 1820. Now, my final response is the disadvantage of military occupation. Once again, a disadvantage of military occupation. In order to go into Mexico and to hold the state, to hold these people from basically destroying each other, the only way we'll be able to do that is by military occupation. That will pull away resources and lives from both the American government and also from a future civil war that we will be fighting. Go ahead.
Did the people of California rebel against us once we annexed them?
No, and that is a different situation. We would contend that California is a completely different situation because California was not a sovereign nation. Mexico is. So now let's move on down to the solvency of the Polk administration. They said the administration could include other things such as congressmen. I have 2 responses. My first response is the administration is not Congress. Once again, the administration is not Congress. You look up any definition of the presidential administration, it will not include the words Congress in there. My second response is you can tag as the administration equals a cabinet. Once again, the administration equals a cabinet. They are simply advisors to the president, not Congress. Therefore, the solvency does stand. In fact, we cannot solve their plan cannot solve for the issue because it doesn't use the right agency and therefore it simply will be overturned. On the solvency of the Civil War resource drain, you can tag my response their response was already started. That's what they were basically arguing was, well, it's already started. You can tag my response as military now must defend. Once again, military now must defend. Basically, we're stretching our resources out by going out here. By doing an interventionist policy, we're stretching our resources. We're now spread out militarily, and we've also, I'd like to point my second response is that we've caused another neighbor to be angry at us. Now we've got South America basically saying, hey, we don't like this. It's not a good idea. Moving on down to imperialism, they basically had 3 arguments, and I could sum all 3 of those arguments up into no impact. They basically said it's not bad, and there's actually a beneficial gain for them. I have a couple of responses. My first response you can tag, they basically said, well, we've never seen this happen before. America has good intentions. We don't mean to hurt people. My first response you can tag as the Cherokees. This is a massively important impact in cities of Oregon. We literally killed thousands of Cherokees on the Trail of Tears. Georgia invaded a sovereign nation. That was obviously a bad thing. We have seen this happen before. Basically, that's the problem with imperialism is thousands of people died. Go ahead.
After we annexed any states during previous history, did we commit any cultural genocide?
I haven't seen that because we haven't actually, usually we kick all the people out before we go in. And that's exactly what happened in Georgia. The state of Georgia invaded Cherokee territory, they kicked them all out, and basically sent them on a trail of tears and killed them all. Now my second response you can tag as not admitted, we haven't proven that they're happy. Once again, we haven't proven that they're happy. We haven't proven in any way, shape, or form that the Mexican people are actually happy to be joining. And therefore, I would strongly urge an opposition ballot because they're actually causing massive unrest in the status quo. And it's for those reasons that I would strongly urge an opposition ballot. Thank you.
So is everyone ready? It's because my partner can see the future and sees exactly what invading Mexico would do the government ballot. Let's first start on the voting issue. We're going to be addressing 3 different voting issues, just boiling down the round, and I'm basically just going to be bringing through what my magic partner said. On voting issue number 1. That of the solvency. Now, there's going to be 2 important parts here under the solvency. Now, the first one is that of admit that Supreme Court overturns. Supreme Court overturns. What's important is that so far in this round, we only have 1 response to this argument. And the only response is that the administration equals Congress. That's simply not true. That's not what the administration is. The president administration is not Congress. So at this point, the Supreme Court will overturn this. They never argued that the president can actually add a state. They never argued against the argumentation. They just argued against our definition of what the administration is. And the presidential administration just includes him and his cabinet, absolutely not Congress. So right there, we have an impact of no solvency. The affirmative team, the government team, does not solve in any way, shape, or form. So now let's move down to the second solvency point. Now the next solvency point is that the Civil War, that it'd be split. They say that we become a stronger nation. And then my partner responded saying that our military would be spread thin. And that's a really important point here because Mexico has a lot of territory. We would be spread thin through this area and not be able to hold on to it. And it'd simply be a waste of resources that would bring about nothing. So now that we've addressed the solvency issues, let's move down to the voting issues of how it's not beneficial. Not beneficial. Now let's look at their contentions. Their contentions were that of slavery abolished. Now under this point, they said that because they'd be basically a free state, slavery would be abolished. But they really never pointed to the fact that there's really no reason to believe that Mexico would be a free state. They never responded to the fact that agriculture, as my partner brought up, the agriculture burned. The idea that Mexico is based off agriculture, and that's where basically slavery during the United States, that's where it thrived. If you look at the actual facts, if you look at what Mexico was during that time, the reasoning says that Mexico would have not been a free state. So ultimately we can see here is that really this contention does not stand. Now let's move down to the contention 2, that of national security. Now my partner responded saying unrest in South America, and that's an important issue here because currently we have no enemies in South America, but after invading and taking over the large country in Central America, we would ultimately see unrest in this area. What happens when you take over a country? Usually the neighboring countries don't go, oh, that's cool. I mean, really, you think about it, that doesn't make any sense. Just think about it. Like, logically, it doesn't make sense that everyone would be happy with this, especially since this was not a voluntary acquisition. This is not a voluntary acquisition. What's important to realize is that they keep bringing up Texas and California as examples, but Texas and California, they were territories, but then they actually applied for stateship? I don't really know what it's called, but they applied to be a state. What's important there is that they applied. It was a voluntary action to apply to be a state. The government team says, you're immediately a state. You can't say anything about it because we have a bigger military. That's basically what the affirmative team is saying. So the government team, goodness, TP is getting into my brain. All right, so let's move down to their contention 3, that of economic gain. Now, under this point, I'd like to just cross-apply my partner's response about the burnout, economic burnout because of this. Then let's move down to contention 4, that of avoiding international conflict. What's important here is this is historically denied. Historically denied. Okay, maybe now it's not international conflict, now it's domestic conflict. Either way you look at it, it's conflict now because we're trying to take over a country. Think about that. That within itself is a conflict. The idea of taking over a country is a conflict within itself. They're suggesting that they're avoiding conflict while taking over a country. That makes no sense if you think about it. So now that we've addressed this point, let's move to the disadvantages, the voting issue number 3, that of the disadvantage. Now, the disadvantages, or my partner's talking about the economic burnout, but then also, which I've already addressed there, but let's move to the disadvantage of imperialism. What's important here is we've seen in the past, when we did take over an entire country, there was actually genocide. If we took over a nation where there was actually genocide, we saw this with the Native Americans when we wiped them out and killed thousands of them, and really, it's simply not right to go into a country and completely take their national identity. They're going to bring up Texas and California as examples, but we actually had, it wasn't actually the same way because it was a mixed culture in these areas, but Mexico has its own cultural identity and its own national identity. There is a difference between its territories and the nation itself. There is no longer Mexico after a government ballot, and that's why I strongly urge an opposition ballot.
Now, in opposing the annexation of Mexico, the opposition team is basically opposing the annexation of California. And I know that we might be surrounded by tons of peach trees, but I have a feeling this place is going to be really populous someday. So with that philosophy in mind, let's get into voting issues, specifically showing some summarized reasons why you should vote for the government team. The first voting issue can be written down as quality. of life. And I'll be responding to every argument that applies under here that's important. There will be some arguments I drop, but I'm going to respond to all the ones that really have a bearing on this round. Let's start out with the slavery argument. One of the responses here was that we would be spreading out the military by putting them in Mexico. Now, I have a couple of responses. The first is only in conflict. The military isn't just going to flood Mexico for no reason. In case of a conflict, the military can move to Mexico, but that happens in literally every part of the United States. My second response is rapid expansions. Now, you may know, of course, we live in a time where the United States has been rapidly expanding. We bought the Louisiana Purchase, which was an enormous piece of land. We never had any of these problems. The United States has been growing exponentially recently. We're just doing it again. We've never had problems. We won't in the future. Let's move on to the Civil War argument. The response here was planning for the future. I have two responses. The first, do what it takes. We should do whatever it takes to get rid of slavery because slavery is awful. My second response is South surrounded. Now, one of their arguments later on was that we're actually putting the military now on the wrong border because the South is in the middle. That's exactly the point. We're surrounding the South. In case of the Civil War, the South is the minority. Not only that, but they're completely surrounded by anti-slavery states and anti-slavery troops. That's exactly what we want, to surround the South. So let's move to some further arguments. First, about California. The response here is that California is not sovereign, that California is different from Mexico. My response is California is Mexico. California is literally a part of Mexico that we recently took over. So is Nevada, so is New Mexico, so is Texas, so are all of those states that we took over. There's not a different culture. They are Mexico. We just took part of Mexico. It's the same culture and everything, and the culture right now is not destroyed. Now, another response here was that it's administration and not cabinet. Now, my response to this is that debate is supposed to be this analogy of the president proposing legislation to Congress. So, of course, it's the administration that is going through with this. Just like in team policy debate, we represent the administration, the judges represent Congress. That's the analogy of it. So we're trying to persuade you as Congress to go with this.
Point of order, this was never addressed. You didn't call them Congress before. So you said the administration was Congress.
Are you saying it's a new argument?
Yeah, new argument.
Okay, well, I was responding to an argument brought up in the negative constructive. If you think that that's an argument, it's not my most important argument, so you can disregard it if you want. Now, the last response here is that Mexico is not actually free, and not that Mexico isn't actually free. They questioned, is Mexico actually a slavery-free state? My response is yes, it is a fact that Mexico is an anti-slavery state, just like California, which was part of Mexico, and they are anti-slavery. Mexico is, that's just a fact. So let's move to the second voting issue, which we written down as national benefit. There would be several ways in which we would be benefiting both our nation and Mexico's. Let's look at the contention 2 responses in the last negative speech and the one before. One of the responses was unrest in South America. I'd urge you to look at the 1800s war. We just got off the heels of the war. South America did not care what happened to Mexico, and we took over part of it. South America isn't scared. They then said wrong border. Again, that is the right border. We want to surround those slavery states. Talking about the mutually beneficial arguments, one of them is historically denied. Specifically, the example of Ukraine, to which you can tag my responses, huh? It's historically denied as we've actually killed a lot of Cherokees. Now, my response here is not the government. It wasn't the government who was telling their own troops to go and kill Cherokees. That actually just happened when the U.S. was first expanding, and there really wasn't a central government controlling the military. The last argument that I think applies under here is that California applied for stateship just like Texas. My response here is all of Mexico. Actually, all of Mexico applied for stateship. The reason that we didn't take all of Mexico is because the United States was afraid that if we took all of Mexico, slavery would be abolished. The reason they were afraid is because that is a fact. Going through with our plan will successfully abolish slavery. So really, we can see that we not only improve the quality of life of American and Mexican citizens, but we improve national security. We get this great order where we surround the most antagonizing people in the United States right now, the South. We get to surround those and abolish slavery. So for all of those benefits, I urge you, annex Mexico.
Thank you so much for judging. Thank you so much for judging.
Very much for judging. Thank you so much for judging.
Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for the time.